He wasn't shouting. He wasn't marching. He was just walking an old black man, a piano professor, and his dog through a quiet street in Boston. But when three officers decided his presence was a problem, the world finally saw what happens when silence is weaponized. And when one boy's drone caught it all, they never expected stillness to start a revolution. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story, it is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you're watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. The pavement on Tremont Street still bore the scent of sun-warmed concrete and salt from the Atlantic breeze, but tonight it tasted like tension. It was the kind of dusk where every shadow felt too still, every silence too intentional. On this particular evening in Charleston, South Carolina, the kind of quiet that crept in wasn't born from peace, it came from scrutiny. It was watching, waiting. Reuben Calloway was a man not easily moved. At 62, his gait was slow, but deliberate, his body big and broad, like an old oak that had weathered every storm it had ever stood in. His skin, deep brown and creased from years under classroom fluorescence, and Carolina sun, was no stranger to assumptions. He was once a professor of music theory, retired now, but still played his upright piano every morning before sunrise, believing sound could soften the hard parts of life. That night, Reuben wore his old varsity jacket from Howard University sleeves, pushed up over thick forearms, and his breath came out in soft puffs as he walked. Beside him trotted his dog, a black and white mutt, with a cautious soul named Booker, named after Booker T. Washington, because Reuben believed even dogs deserved legacies. Booker didn't bark much, but he watched everything. They were just out for their evening walk. They always took the long loop through the district, past the shuttered jazz club, where Reuben once gave free lessons to kids, past the cracked memorial for the old battery battalion, and finally, up toward the top of Tremont, where the trees bowed like they were praying. That's where it happened. It wasn't the first time Reuben had noticed the cruiser, but this time it didn't keep its distance. No flashing lights, no siren, just the ominous crawl of headlights behind them, low, slow, intentional. There were three of them inside. Officer Travis Hale, lean and hawkish, always chewing gum like it was a challenge. Officer Jared Mendez, quiet, unreadable fingers, always too close to the holster. And then there was Officer Lee Whitcomb, young, pale, and twitchy, like a man who'd read too many news headlines but understood none. Reuben didn't turn around. He kept walking. So did Booker. The cruiser inched closer. At the top of the hill, the street lamp flickered once and died. Just darkness now. The engine idled. The sound of power wrapped in concern. Reuben slowed, not from fear, but to listen. Evening. Hale finally called out from the window, the faux cordial tone already curdled with something more predatory. Reuben turned, expression calm, but immovable. Evening, he replied. You live around here? Mendez asked, voice flat. I do. What's your name? You first, Reuben said. That was the moment it shifted. The doors opened. Not all at once, sequential, measured like a performance. Hale approached from the front, Whitcomb to the side. Mendez remained near the cruiser, arms crossed. Booker stepped slightly in front of Reuben, his tail low, his eyes alert. Sir, We've received reports. Whitcomb said his hand grazing the baton clipped to his belt. Reports of what Reuben asked. Hale offered a smirk. You fit the description. Big, black, walking a dog. Reuben replied the words heavy, but not loud. A beat of silence. Let us see some ID, Hale said. No law says I need to carry it to walk my dog. Refusal to comply is not a crime. Reuben interrupted his voice, low and steady, like the beginning of a requiem. Another beat. And then the dog growled. Booker's throat rumbled, not loud, not threatening, just a sound of awareness. And yet Whitcomb flinched. His hand tightened around the baton. That's when Hale stepped forward. Control your dog. He is controlled, Reuben said without looking down. Suddenly lights. From across the street, a flicker of red blinked in the air. A drone. No bigger than a bird, its camera eye unblinking. Somewhere, someone was watching. Hale noticed. Mendez looked up. Cut it out! Hale barked toward the sky, as if the camera could obey. But Reuben just smiled. Not with arrogance, with certainty. You thought no one was watching, he said. But the city never sleeps, gentlemen. And neither does truth. And that's when Booker did something unexpected. He sat. Calmly. Just sat. And Reuben followed, lowering himself onto the curb legs, stretched out Booker at his side. You going to arrest me for sitting now? He asked, voice like worn velvet. Hale said nothing, because they knew it. They felt it. The shift. The presence of the eye above. The wariness in the air. The stories starting to write themselves in real time. And somewhere someone was recording. Not for justice, but for truth. And sometimes that's even more dangerous. That night on Tremont Street, nothing exploded. No gunshots. No sirens. Just stillness. Just a big black man and his quiet dog sitting beneath a broken street lamp, surrounded by officers trying to decide how far they could go before the camera caught too much. And yet, it would be this moment, not the dramatic kind, not the violent kind that cracked something wide open. It would be this stillness, misunderstood and misjudged, that would echo through Charleston, through the internet, through the country. Because sometimes what shakes the world is not the scream, but the silence it refuses to obey. The next morning, Reuben Calloway stood at his window, nursing a chipped mug of black coffee that had long since cooled. Outside Tremont Street looked deceptively ordinary. Mailboxes, porches, the occasional passing car. But nothing about it felt familiar anymore. Since that encounter, the sidewalk had become more than concrete. It was a stage, a test, and more than anything, a spotlight. He hadn't slept much. Booker had stayed curled at the foot of his bed all night, alert to every creak, every gust of wind, every distant bark that sounded off rhythm. Reuben's mind spun, not just with the tension of what happened, but the implication of what could have, and what still might. It didn't end on the hill. The patrol car had returned. First, quietly, then confidently. At noon, the next day, Reuben saw it again, parked across from the community garden, where he volunteered every Saturday. Officer Travis Hale leaning against the hood, arms folded chewing gum, with that same smug detachment. Officer Mendez stood by a tree, speaking into his shoulder, mic eyes, never leaving Reuben. Whitcomb wasn't visible, but Reuben knew he was there. Always was. Somewhere behind the tint. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. Their silence was designed to be loud. The people walking past, the parents pushing strollers, the joggers in neon shorts, the elderly couple from the Baptist church pretended not to see. That was the part that burned. Not the presence of the officers, the absence of outrage, the quiet complicity. This was Charleston after all, a city that held its ghosts tightly in its history, always speaking of reconciliation while carefully avoiding confrontation. Reuben didn't confront them, not yet. Instead, he gathered his tools and returned to weeding the raised bed of collard greens. He refused to let them dictate his rhythm, but he felt it, the pressure, the knowing, the game being played where the rules were invisible, the consequences all too real. Later that evening, he took the long way home, avoided Tremont, cut through Maple Avenue instead, where the houses leaned slightly from years of hurricanes and prayers. Booker walked beside him, attentive as ever. Every corner they turned felt like a checkpoint. Every car that slowed sent a flicker through Reuben's spine. He wasn't afraid, not in the way fear usually lived. This was ancestral cellular older than him. It was the kind of alertness that black men passed down like heirlooms, how to shrink your presence without losing your dignity, how to watch without being seen. The next day, the cruiser appeared again, this time outside the barber shop. It was Saturday, the busiest day of the week. Reuben had come for his usual trim. He liked the place, not because of the cut, but because of the conversation. Mr. Ellis ran the shop like a community council chamber. Debates flared and cooled in the space of a haircut. Jazz played low from a battered speaker, and kids always loitered out front, hoping for a free lollipop or leftover fries from next door. But that day, the energy was different. When Reuben stepped inside, the conversation stopped. Heads turned toward the window. The cruiser was idling directly across the street, and Hale's silhouette sat like a gargoyle in the front seat. Reuben tried to laugh it off. Guess I brought company. Mr. Ellis didn't smile. They'd been circling all morning. Another man, Darius, a retired firefighter, shook his head. What they waiting on? Nobody answered. Because everyone knew. They weren't waiting for a crime. They were waiting for a reaction. Outside, Booker stood tied to the street lamp posture tents, watching the cruiser like it was a rival animal. He didn't bark. He never did. Just watched. As Reuben sat in the chair, he caught his reflection in the mirror. Something in his face had hardened. It wasn't anger exactly. It was recognition. This how it starts, he said softly. What you mean? Ellis asked, cape already around his shoulders. Reuben met his own eyes in the mirror. They don't always need to touch you to hurt you. Sometimes all they gotta do is let everyone else see you being hunted and make it look normal. Silence settled heavy over the room. That evening, he didn't walk. He sat on the porch Booker at his feet and wrote. Words came slow, but certain like footsteps on gravel. He wasn't sure if it was a statement or a letter or a story. He just knew that if he didn't get it out, it would rot inside him. The knock came just after 10. Not the police. A boy, 14 maybe, holding a phone and a question. Sir, are you the man they followed on Tremont? Reuben blinked. Who's asking? The boy lifted his phone. I'm Elijah. I saw it. My brother flew the drone. We got the video. Reuben's chest tightened. You filmed it? The boy nodded. We didn't mean to. We were just testing it. But it's all there. I just wanted to ask if it's okay if we post it. People should see it, right? Reuben didn't speak for a long time. He looked past the boy, out into the dark. The cruiser wasn't there tonight. But that didn't mean it was gone. Finally, he said, if you post it, make sure you don't just show me. Show them, and show that I didn't stop walking. The boy nodded. We will. And just like that, he was gone. Reuben looked down at Booker, who shifted slightly closer, ears twitching. "They think they can erase us without touching us," Reuben said quietly, more to the dog than himself. "But maybe not this time." Inside, the light from the boy's phone glowed briefly on the living room wall as he uploaded the file. And in a world so used to surveillance turning inward, always aimed at the black body, the black threat, something shifted. This time, someone had turned the lens around. The morning after the video surfaced, Reuben Calloway sat alone in the back of the neighborhood cafe, a place that once buzzed with the comfort of routine and neighborly noise. Now silence sat in every booth like an uninvited guest. The barista, a young white woman who'd once drawn smiling suns on his to-go cup, barely looked at him. The regulars, who used to nod in recognition, pretended not to notice him at all. Even the music that used to hum softly from the speakers was gone. It was as if the very air had stiffened. Booker rested beneath the table, alert, but calm, his chest rising in slow rhythm. Reuben stirred his coffee but didn't drink. The footage had only been online for 16 hours, and already it had carved fault lines through his town. Through him. Through everyone. The drone caught more than a moment. It had captured intent. Captured power unmasked. Captured the precise choreography of fear dressed in protocol. He hadn't watched the full video. Couldn't. But he'd seen enough. Enough to recognize the subtle lean in Officer Hale's stance, the shift in Officer Mendez's weight before reaching. Enough to remember how Booker had moved perfectly trained, perfectly still, until provoked not by touch, but by tone, by encroachment, by instinct. Enough to remember the burn of breath in his chest as he realized they weren't there to serve, but to circle. Back at home, the messages had started. Some from strangers offering praise, others not even veiled in hatred. His voicemail held threats. His inbox carried demands. One email simply read, "Keep walking, you're next." No name, no return address. But amid the noise, one letter stood out. It came by post, handwritten, the envelope slightly smudged by rain. Inside, a single line. "My father marched in Selma. You're why he did." No signature, just truth delivered like a blessing. Reuben pinned that letter above his desk. That evening, he returned to Tremont Street. Not to walk, but to listen. It was quiet, unnaturally so. The kind of quiet where nothing dares to move for fear of being seen. Reuben had grown up with that kind of silence. It lived in black homes like an extra wall. Don't speak too loud. Don't draw attention. Don't forget the rules, even when they're not written. He sat on the same bench Naomi used to favor beneath the jacaranda tree, now in full bloom. Purple petals fluttered like ash in the breeze. Across the street, the cruiser wasn't parked. But Reuben didn't take that as absence. He took it as strategy. Booker stayed close, sitting upright, ears twitching toward every sound. Reuben watched the windows of the houses nearby, curtains, fluttering blinds, shifting. People were watching. They always had been. But now they didn't know how to look. He closed his eyes, let the breeze lift the tension from his shoulders for a moment, and tried to remember the songs his mother used to hum while sweeping the porch. No lyrics, just a melody. He hadn't thought of it in years, but suddenly it played in his memory like a record spinning for the first time in a long time. It wasn't a protest song. It wasn't a hymn. It was something older, woven, a melody carried from her grandmother, and hers. Carried from chains and fields and front porches and bus boycotts, carried through generations like gospel. That melody, unwritten, unseen, had kept people alive when the world tried to disappear them. That was the melody he heard now, in the quiet. in his blood. He opened his eyes to find a child standing near the curb. A little girl, maybe 7, with braids and wide, curious eyes. "Mister is your dog." Famous Reuben blinked, caught off guard. "What makes you say that he's in the video?" "My big cousin showed me. Said he saved you." Reuben smiled gently, the first in days. "He didn't save me. He reminded me I was worth saving." The girl nodded solemn, in the way only children can be. "I told my class about it. My teacher got weird. She changed the subject, but I think it was brave." Her words landed like music. Clean, clear, true. "What's your name?" Reuben asked. "Aaliyah." "Well, Aaliyah, you just made my day." She beamed, then skipped back across the street, her mother waving an awkward half apology before pulling her inside. But Reuben didn't mind. That moment had cracked something open. The truth was, he'd forgotten what it meant to be visible on his own terms. For years, he'd worked hard to make himself quiet, agreeable, small enough to pass through rooms without stirring discomfort. Even his grief, his private ache over a partner lost too soon, had been folded into silence. Booker's leash, once just routine, had become a tether to safety, to structure, to memory. But the video had unspooled all of that. The world had seen him, not curated, not censored, not pre-approved for palatability, just him. A large black man, middle-aged, widowed, walking his dog. And somehow, that had been enough to warrant 3 armed men watching him like a threat. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if the investigation they whispered about would actually change anything. But he knew this: he would not be made small again. That night, Reuben dug through an old box in the back of his closet. Inside were cassette tapes, recordings of oral histories collected during his graduate years. Black elders recounting their own invisible melodies of bus rides to nowhere, of churches set ablaze, of dancing in secret during curfews. He found one tape, labeled simply Eloise, 1973. He put it into the deck-pressed play and closed his eyes. A voice cracked with age, rich with rhythm, filled the room. "They always tried to write us out," Eloise said. "But baby, we knew the song. We kept it in our bones. And that's how we lasted." Reuben sat still. Booker curled at his feet, and the unseen melody played on. The courthouse was colder than Reuben had imagined. Not in temperature, though the air conditioning whirred too loudly, but in the way people avoided eye contact, as if guilt could be contagious. The floor tiles gleamed sterile and silent beneath his shoes, and the wooden benches creaked with the weight of tension. He sat at the front, not alone, but still lonely, with a quiet defiance that had become second nature. Booker was waiting outside, not permitted to enter. That more than anything made the place feel foreign. Unjust. Reuben wore a suit that hadn't been touched since Jamal's memorial, still sharp at the shoulders, but tighter around his midsection. He didn't care. He hadn't worn it for style. He wore it because it reminded him who he was before the world called him something else. Before they saw a silhouette and made him a suspect, a threat, a problem. His fingers brushed over the lapel, where a pin gleamed a small bronze treble clef, a gift from Jamal given on their 5th anniversary. "For when you forget your music," Jamal had said, "because you are Rue. You don't just walk through the world, you move through it in time." That morning, before heading to court, Reuben had sat at their old piano. Dust had settled across the ivory keys like snow. He played a chord, just one, and the sound rang out imperfect but alive. He played another. The melody that came was fractured, hesitant, like the heart that fed it. But by the fifth chord, his fingers remembered. He had once believed music could hold everything. Now it was the only thing that didn't lie. Inside the courtroom, the judge took the bench. Reporters lined the back row like crows with pens. Jurors shuffled the weight of the moment thick in their bodies. Officer Benjamin Hale, Officer Carlos Mendez, and rookie officer Stephen Rourke sat with stiff spines and well-ironed uniforms. Hale's jaw was locked like a vault. Mendez looked like a man bored of accountability. Rourke shifted constantly, unable to find comfort in a room that wasn't designed to offer any. When they called his name, Reuben didn't hesitate. He stood and walked to the witness stand like he had walked every sidewalk in Boston, deliberate with a rhythm that said, "I belong here." He swore in, and for a second all he could hear was the ringing silence of that piano key from earlier. Imperfect, but alive. The prosecutor began gently. No drama, just truth. "Mr. Calloway, can you describe the events of August 7th? He did, carefully, without embellishment, with memory intact and eyes steady. He described the path, the feeling, the sound of the cruiser rolling behind him with its lights off, the reach toward his chest, the weight of Booker's restraint, the moment when instinct replaced protocol and dignity replaced fear. He recounted the smell in the air, eucalyptus and ocean salt twisted now with something sour. He talked about the look in Hale's eyes, the kind of gaze that didn't ask questions but made decisions. That called a man's skin a threat before he ever spoke. "What were you thinking when Officer Mendez reached toward your necklace?" the prosecutor asked. Reuben exhaled. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "that this was what my father warned me about. The moment they stop pretending to see you and start deciding what kind of ghost you're going to be." There were murmurs, quiet and sharp. The judge called for silence, but the damage was done. The weight of those words was now in the room. The defense tried to shake him, suggested that he had misread the situation, that he had provoked it, that the dog Booker had escalated matters. "You trained him to attack, didn't you?" the defense attorney asked. "No," Reuben replied calmly. "He was trained to protect. There's a difference, and you'd know it if you ever needed it." The defense pivoted to the footage, tried to suggest that the drone video was out of context, that perhaps it didn't capture everything, that body language could be misunderstood. Reuben didn't flinch. The camera didn't need to understand, he said. It just needed to witness. When he stepped down from the stand, he didn't feel victorious. He felt exposed. But not in the way the officers had left him weeks ago. This exposure was honest, voluntary, powerfully chosen. Back on the bench, he sat straighter. The prosecutor called other witnesses, experts in police conduct, others who had quietly filed complaints about Hale and Mendez in the past. A black mother who described how her teenage son was stopped 6 times in 4 months. A Latino schoolteacher who had been asked to step out of his own car in his own driveway. Each testimony painted a pattern, one that the officers had counted on being invisible. That night, Reuben returned home and sat again at the piano. This time, he played Jamal's favorite song, a gospel piece, slow and sweet, the kind that wrapped around you like a hymn and a home. His hands didn't tremble. Halfway through, he began to hum. For the first time in weeks, he let the melody carry him, not out of grief, but out of defiance. He was not what they called him. He was not a threat. He was not a problem. He was a man who had loved and lost, who had walked with dignity, who had refused to be erased. Outside, Booker lay beside the porch ears, perked toward the wind, ready. Inside, Reuben let the final note ring. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive, and that was enough. In the days after the verdict, the city didn't erupt, it exhaled. Not in celebration, not even in mourning, but in something more subtle, more permanent. A shift, a collective cracking of something long calcified. The stone buildings of Boston remained the same, weathered and wise. The Charles River still glistened beneath the morning sun, indifferent to history. But the people, especially the ones who had once chosen silence, now walked with glances a beat longer, thoughts a breath heavier. They had seen something they could no longer deny. Reuben Calloway had not set out to make a city remember him. He had only wanted to walk in peace, to grieve in his own skin, to keep the memory of Jamal stitched into the rhythm of his life like the piano chords he played every night to quiet the ghosts. But the world had different plans. And when the world pushed, Reuben had not crumbled. He had stood, not loudly, not vengefully, but entirely. The verdict had come swift and stunning, guilty on all counts, not just because of the footage or the drone or the testimony, but because of the unmistakable weight of truth when it walks into a courtroom and refuses to make itself small. The city didn't forget the silence of the officers. It didn't forget Booker's snarl that echoed louder than any command. And most of all, it didn't forget the man who never raised his voice, but raised a mirror instead. For days afterward, people talked. Some whispered his name like a prayer. Others spat it like a curse. But either way, they remembered. Children on Tremont Street pointed out his house. The florist who once crossed the street now left white camellias at his gate. Even the jazz club Jamal once dreamed of playing piped one of his unreleased recordings through the speakers, letting the saxophone curl into the night like a long-lost apology. And still, Reuben remained quiet. Not because he didn't feel it. All he did, but because some storms don't announce their end with thunder. They settle. They heal. They wait for what comes next. He walked the trail again, the one where the cruiser had shadowed him. He walked it slowly, not to reclaim it. He never lost it, but to remind himself that nothing had been stolen that wasn't now exposed. The eucalyptus trees rustled gently in the breeze, as if bowing to something greater than justice, dignity. Along the bend, where everything began, a group of college students had painted a mural. It wasn't grand or overly symbolic. It showed a silhouette of a man at a piano, a dog sitting faithfully at his feet, and a line of musical notes floating from the keys into the air. No words, just presence. What the city would remember wasn't rage. It wasn't fire or fists. It wasn't even fear. It would remember that a man named Reuben Calloway had shown them a different kind of resistance, the kind that sits in your spirit long after the headlines fade, the kind that dares to grieve loudly in a world that wants your sorrow silent, the kind that refuses to shrink even when surrounded. Booker, older now, walked slower beside him, but his eyes were sharp, always scanning, always listening. And Reuben knew he wasn't just walking with a dog. He was walking with history, with memory, with Jamal. He stopped at the top of the hill and looked down at the city. The building stood tall, but today he didn't feel smaller. He felt seen. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. What the city would remember wasn't the trial. It wasn't the verdict. It was the sound of a man who kept walking, the stillness that became a roar, and the echo that would never leave them. Reuben Calloway's story wasn't born from noise. It was carved from silence. A quiet, grieving, retired black music professor who only wanted to walk his dog and remember his late husband, a man who lived gently in a world that too often treated his existence like a provocation. His walk wasn't just a ritual, it was a form of protest. His stillness wasn't just peace, it was resistance. And what unfolded on Tremont Street became more than an incident. It became a mirror. Reuben did not fight back with fists or fury. He fought with presence, with deliberate steps, with a war-trained dog named Booker at his side, and a melody of memory playing quietly behind his every move. And when 3 officers tried to turn his grief into guilt, tried to wrap suspicion around his dignity, Reuben did not shrink. He held the line, not with rage, but with truth. It was a drone, a teenager's accidental witness that turned private surveillance into public reckoning. The world watched stunned as a man was encircled not for what he did, but for who he was. And they watched as he didn't lash out, but stood still. And in that stillness, the world shifted. The trial that followed was never just about 3 officers. It was about the system that allowed them to move like that, the community that turned away, the silence that had been normalized. And Reuben, who never asked to be the center of any storm, became the eye of it. His testimony was not dramatic, it was deliberate. His story was not exaggerated, it was precise. And when the verdict came guilty on all counts, it wasn't victory he felt, it was visibility. For the first time in decades, he was no longer being watched as a threat, but witnessed as a man. Not perfect, not saintly, but human. Fully and finally. His return to that same trail, days after the verdict, was more than symbolic. It was a declaration. That dignity is not something the world gives you. It's something you insist on keeping, step by step, note by note. The lesson we carry forward. Reuben's story teaches us that resilience is not loud. It doesn't always show up with slogans or speeches. Sometimes resilience looks like walking your dog through a neighborhood that's trying to erase you. Sometimes it's in the refusal to lower your eyes. Sometimes it's simply staying visible when everything around you says disappear. For anyone who's been made to feel too much, too different, too inconvenient for the world around them, Reuben's story is yours too. His stillness was not surrender. It was defiance, shaped by age, wisdom, and grief. In our everyday lives, we may not face a courtroom or a drone, but we all face moments where we're asked to be smaller than we are. We're told to quiet our truth, to round our edges. But Reuben reminds us that how we exist is a form of protest. How we move is a legacy. So take up space. Stand with quiet strength. Walk the hard roads. And if you're ever unsure of what to do when the world closes in, remember Reuben Calloway. Remember that sometimes being still is how you roar. If this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel seen, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support fuels stories like these stories that deserve to be told, stories that remind us who we are and who we can become. We have many more powerful journeys ahead, and we'd love to walk that path with you.